Speaking section. The speaking section tests your ability to communicate in English in an academic setting. During the test, you will be presented with 4 speaking questions. The questions ask for a response to a single question, a talk, or a lecture. The prompts and questions are presented on time. You may take notes as you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Some of the questions ask for a response to a reading passage and a talk or a lecture. The reading passages and the questions are written, but the directions will be spoken. Your speaking will be evaluated on both the fluency of the language and the accuracy of the content. You will have 15 to 20 seconds to prepare and 45 to 60 seconds to respond to each question. Typically, a good response will require all of the response time and the answer will be complete by the end of the response time. You will have about 17 minutes to complete the speaking section. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to prepare each of your answers and how much time you have to record each response.
You will now be asked a question about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you will have 15 seconds to plan your response and 45 seconds to speak.
Do you agree or disagree with the statement below? Private cars should not be permitted in large city centers. Explain your point of view with specifics and examples.
You will now read a short passage and then listen to a conversation on the same topic. You will then be asked a question about the passages. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak. You have 45 seconds to read the passage below.
Now listen to two students discussing the article.
Hey, did you read about this plan?
Yeah, and I think it's a really great idea.
Why's that?
Well, a lot of new students really need this. I mean, it's not just about getting extra help with the course material. They'll probably also get information about things like taking notes or the best way to study for exams.
Yeah, I barely even knew how to do those things when I first came here.
Neither did I. So these are things most students wind up having to learn on their own at first. That's why so many of them have a hard time.
And it's probably good that they can work with somebody who has the same interests.
Right. That would be a real advantage, to get information about the classes you're going to need to take from somebody who's already taken those classes. And they could recommend professors and tell you who the best advisors in the department are. Things like that.
I see what you mean. So new students could get access to information about the program from another student's point of view.
Exactly.
The woman shows her views on the university's proposed idea. Summarize the approach. Then express her opinions about the plan and explain why.
You will now read a short passage and then listen to a lecture on the same topic. You will then be asked a question about the passage. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak. You have 45 seconds to read the passage below. You may begin reading now.
Now listen to part of a lecture on this topic in a psychology class.
Some researchers did an experiment related to this. What they did was they assembled a group of students, and they showed these students a series of geometrical shapes. These were very distinctive shapes, a little unusual, not the kind of shapes the students often see. But they only showed the students the shapes for a very short period of time, about a second. They also lowered the light in the room to make it even more difficult for the students to see the shapes. So the shapes were there for a split second in dim light, and then they were gone. In the next step of the experiment, the researchers again showed the students some shapes, but this time they gave the students a longer time to look at them. And this time they showed the images in pairs, 2 at a time. In each pair, one shape was a shape the students had already seen, for just a split second, in dim light, and the other was some other shape that hadn't been shown to them before. After presenting each pair, the researchers asked the students to say which of the 2 shapes they liked better. Most of the time, the students preferred the shape they'd already seen earlier in the experiment. Now, if you asked them if they'd already seen that shape, they probably wouldn't know for sure. But that didn't matter. They still tended to prefer the shapes they'd already seen.
Explain how the professor's experiment demonstrates the familiarity principle.
You will now listen to part of a lecture. You will then be asked a question about it. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
So, okay, we've been talking about frogs, and like all amphibians, frogs have thin skin, which means that they lose moisture through their skin easily. Now, typically, we think of frogs as living in wet environments, but for frogs who live in dry places with desert-like conditions, this can be a problem. Frogs have been able to survive in such areas by having different physical features, special dry climate features that help them maintain an adequate level of moisture in their cells and avoid drying out. Some frogs do this by preventing water loss through their skin. By creating a sort of covering over their skin, they greatly reduce their skin's exposure to the dry air. The covering acts like a barrier that locks in moisture. For example, some frogs secrete a substance through their skin, a fatty substance that they rub all over their skin using their hands and feet, which creates a waxy layer all around their bodies that's almost completely watertight. Other frogs maintain an adequate level of moisture through a different physical feature, one that allows them to store water inside their bodies for later use. A specially modified internal organ inside their bodies enables them to have a high water storage capacity. So the frogs are able to absorb and store moisture during wet, rainy times, which they can rely on to get through dry periods. The aptly named water-holding frog, for example, has a bladder that is highly elastic and stretchable. When it does rain, the frog absorbs water through its skin, and its bladder stretches to hold this extra water. The water is then slowly released from the special bladder into the frog's internal tissues until the next rain, which might not be for several months.
Explain 2 dry climate characteristics of frogs using ideas and examples from the lecture.